good morning. How in the world are you? You guys doing well? It's good to see you. Hey, if you are a guest who's returning from our Easter service last Sunday, thanks for coming back. We're really glad that you're here, and we invite you to come back as often as you like. It's really interesting how it works. If you come back one Sunday as a guest, then you come back another Sunday as a guest, and you keep coming back, then you're no longer a guest. Now you're just part of the family. We'd love to have you be a part of our family. We'd love to serve your family. So if there's any way that we can be of help, don't hesitate to let us know. It's good to see all of you. So a couple years ago, I read an article. Unfortunately, I don't remember where the article was found or where it was that I found it. And so I didn't archive it to keep it on hand if I should ever use it. But I remember the story enough to be able to tell you about it. It was a story about a gentleman, and he was this very popular and intelligent professor. He had a faculty position at one of the prestigious Ivy League universities, and he was considered a genius and the expert in his particular field of study. He was sought from all over the world. He would go and do these lectures for thousands and thousands of dollars for people who wanted to hear him speak on his specialty. He served as a consultant to a number of corporations around the world who, again, paid him a handsome fee to come and share what he knew. He wrote a number of popular books in his field, and hundreds and hundreds of copies of those were sold. He was a big deal. And he was always referred to as like a genius. So professionally, he was incredibly successful. But the article went on to describe his personal life, which was a mess. He had been married and divorced, married and divorced, married and divorced several more times. There were rumors that followed him as a professor that he was engaged in a number of romantic relationships with his students. While he made absolute millions of dollars with the sales of his books and his services as a consultant, he was virtually broke because he so poorly mismanaged his money. And his body was broken because of a long time abuse of alcohol and drugs. He was a mess. And the article went on to describe the fact that this wasn't some, phenomenon that could be described as he was autistic or on the Asperger's spectrum, where he was just so incredibly intelligent and yet socially dysfunctional. It wasn't that situation. He was a person who was incredibly brilliant on one dimension of his life, and in another dimension of his life, he was just completely stupid with the way that he managed his life. And the article was about, how is this possible? Somebody so intelligent, so brilliant, a genius, who couldn't transfer what he knew to some of the basic routines and responsibilities of life. Well, I find that interesting myself. I'm fascinated with that sort of dilemma. Now, most all of you in this room, you're familiar with these two terms, book smart versus street smart. Just by way of getting us all on the same page, book smart is a lot about intelligence. It's a lot about learning. It's a lot about academics and academia. It's about what you can gather from books and lectures and blogs and podcasts. It's about collecting enormous amounts of information, assimilating it, and then being able to use it in particular situations. And there's plenty of people in our world who are book smart. And then there's this thing that, again, we're mostly familiar with, this idea of street smarts. And a person who can't even read, a person who never graduated from high school, could have street smarts, but not a lot of book smarts. Street smarts tends to be associated with this idea of wisdom. So there's intelligence and there's wisdom. A person who has street smarts, although they may not have a lot of academic prowess, they tend to understand how life really works in reality. Not like it's described in a book, not like it's talked about in a classroom, but like how life really works. They have a sense for this. Somebody with street smarts. So for instance, just by way of an illustration, you could go to any major city in the United States that has a public transportation system. And most likely they have a subway system. And you could go to that city to the subway system with a person who's made a living designing subways. And they could tell you everything that you could possibly want to know about how a subway system works. And they could tell you about tracks, and they could tell you about electricity, and they could tell you about fuel, and they could tell you about engines and carriages, and they could tell you about seating capacities and weight limits, and they could tell you about like signals and how they work and how they're coordinated electronically. They could tell you about how tunnels are made and how they are kept safe. They could tell you everything that you'd ever want to know about how a subway system works. But that same person with that incredible brilliance may not be able to tell you that if you're a certain age, a certain gender, or a certain race, there are certain places in town you shouldn't take the subway to after midnight. So they have book smarts, but they may not have street smarts. Does that make sense? So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of being really smart and then this idea of being wise, because there is an enormous difference. So this series is about the difference between wisdom and intelligence. Now, I've always said, and I believe this, that only smart people come to Cibolo Creek Community Church. So we're going to work from the assumption that all of you in this room are really smart people. But my question is, are you wise people? Are you a wise person? So here's, again, the difference. Intelligence, book smarts, knowledge applied, so it's an understanding of information, knowledge applied to a subject accurately. Somebody who's really smart can take what they know and apply it to one situation or a number of situations, which kind of shows you their brilliance. In contrast, wisdom is not so much about knowledge. Now, knowledge is a part of this, but it's about truth. It's like understanding knowledge. Truth applied to a situation appropriately, like knowing how to apply what you know to a given situation or circumstance in life. So there's a book in the Old Testament of your Bible that's all about the difference between intelligence and wisdom. It's a book all about wise living. And here's just by way of illustration, here's one of the two of the verses from the book of Proverbs that I think is a wonderful illustration of like the difference between intelligence and wisdom. These are two verses back to back, Proverbs chapter 26, verses 4 and 5. So they immediately follow each other. Do not answer a fool, the proverb is, do not answer a fool according to his folly. Now, in this context, this discussion, a fool is somebody who thinks they know it all. They think they got it all figured out. You're not going to tell them anything different. They think that they have this subject mastered. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him. Then the very next verse, answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. And you're like, wait, what? You said two different things, completely opposite. You tell me I'm supposed to answer a fool, and then you tell me I shouldn't answer a fool. Now, here's the difference. I mean, here's an interesting thing. Intelligence is, I know what the answer is. Take any socially or politically sensitive topic right now, the wall, abortion, gender identity. Take any of these subjects that people have very strong opinions and beliefs and perspectives on. You may get in a discussion with a person or a group of people, and you may know an answer. You may have facts and figures and all sorts of data to demonstrate that you have an intelligent understanding of the subject and you have a viewpoint, an opinion, and perspective. But here's the deal. Here's the difference between intelligence and wisdom. Intelligence knows what the answer is. Wisdom knows whether I offer the answer or not. You see, wisdom is about being able to discern what kind of situation you're in right now. Who are the players? What's the environment like? What's the emotional tension in the room? And a wise person decides, you know what? This would be a really helpful time for me to speak up. Or a wise person discerns, you know what? With the current emotional energy in the room right now and who these players are, I'd just be wiser. It would be more helpful, more productive if I just stayed quiet. An intelligent person will always want to make sure everybody understands their perspective. A wise person will always understand, I don't always have to have an answer or speak up. Does that make sense? So there's this entire book in the Bible that's all about learning how to be a wise person and go about living a wise life. And so I would like to spend 4 Sundays exploring this particular book of the Bible. Now, this happens to be my favorite book in the Bible. This happens to be my favorite topic in all of life. And so if you're not as interested in it as I am, I'm going to enjoy myself the next 4 Sundays. And maybe you'll find this helpful. So here's the deal. Proverbs is a book of advice. Again, in the kind of the center of your Old Testament, Proverbs is a book of advice. It's a collection of observations about life intended to help us live wisely. That's the underpinning idea of why the book of Proverbs exists. It's simply some observations about life offered as advice so that you and I could live our lives in a very wise manner. Now, it's really interesting how the book is laid out, and I just want to give you a little bit of a backdrop to the book of Proverbs to help set the stage for our discussion. In the first 9 chapters, the book has 31 chapters in. The first 9 chapters are slightly different than the rest of the chapters. In the first 9 chapters, you will hear a particular phrase repeated again and again and again and again, and that is the phrase, my son. My son, my son, my son, my son, listen. My son, understand. My son, don't ever forget. My son, remember. And so the author of the book is using a literary creative device to say, I'm going to make this sound like, I'm going to portray this as if a father is sitting down with his young son, let's say a son who's early teens. The father's sitting down with his son, and the father's saying, son, I've lived a little bit longer than you. From experience, I've learned some things that your experience hasn't afforded you. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to share the learnings about life that I've made. I'd like to help you kind of anticipate what life brings, warn you about some dangers that you might face throughout life, and I'd like to help you avoid making some of those same mistakes. And so it's his first 9 chapters, it's this dad talking to his son. Here's some things about living wisely. And then from chapter 10 all the way to the end of chapter 31, it's just a collection of all of these proverbial observations, one after another. Sometimes they're not even related to each other. You'll read a chapter and you're like, what's the theme here? And there is no theme. There's just all these collections of proverbs, which is essentially saying this. The dad and his son had a very long conversation. And in the first 9 chapters, here's sort of how that conversation looked. And then the rest of the book is here's all the other things that they talked about, but we're not going to portray it in the same way. Does that make sense? What's really fascinating about the book of Proverbs is the first 9 chapters is this dad talking to his son, sharing with him his observations of life. Then you get to chapter 31, the last chapter of the book. And we get into this very interesting discussion about marriage and wives. And I just want to go on record. If there's Christian women in the room who have been to a conference or a Bible study or some other setting where the teacher has been talking about the Proverbs 31 woman, and it sounded a lot like the Proverbs 31 perfect wife, where you get this impression like the wife has to be everything, do everything, amazing, while the husband sort of sits back and watches. And you were somehow led to believe that Proverbs 31 was about what you should be like as a woman and as a wife. I'm so sorry that the church and preachers and preacheresses have led you to believe that, because you know what? It's not about marriage and it's not about a woman at all. You see, the first 9 chapters is about a dad sitting down with his son, and he's saying, son, I'd like you to learn to live this way. And so he comes to the end of the book, and in the metaphorical use of the woman throughout the book, he's saying, son, if you do anything, marry wisdom. Marry a wise way of life. Partner with God's wisdom as described in the scriptures. Unite your life with her, because then it will go well for you. The last chapter of the book of Proverbs is just about as much about men as it is women. There's no logical reason why this book is talking about living a wise life, and it's talking about men and women, and then it takes this sharp left-hand turn and just talking about marriage and wives and women and how they should behave. No, it's the author saying, son, when you get to that place in your life where you're making your choices about how you're going to do your life, please spend all of your life with wisdom, because she will reward you in ways that you can't imagine. So this is a lot about what the book of Proverbs is about. Couple things. Proverbs are born out of observations about the patterns of life. That's all a proverb is. It's like the author has stood back and he's observed life, and he's watched this and this and this, and he's watched them over time, and then he said, hey, wait a second. If you follow that particular thought, it almost always goes the same way. It's like relationships, friendships. They almost always take the same path. And money, it almost always takes the same path. Sexuality, it almost always takes the same path. Alcohol, it almost always takes the same path. And so then the writer has taken his observations and he's established some very succinct statement to say, here's a pattern about the way that life works, and you would do well to learn from it. The bottom line of the book of Proverbs is saying this: intelligent people, they have to make the mistakes that hurt them to learn from them. But a wise person can look at the mistakes of other people and not have to experience the same pain and brokenness and learn a wise way to live life. So a proverb is simply an observation about the way that life generally works. So this is the first thing I want you to know. The proverb, every time you read a proverb, the writer is simply saying this. This is generally how it goes. Remember that commercial a few years ago? 4 out of 5 dentists? Anybody my age? You remember that? Golly. 4 out of 5 dentists, meaning there's an observation that most of the time it's going to work like this in life. Are there exceptions? Absolutely. It's very important when you read the Proverbs that you distinguish between a proverb and a promise, because there's a difference. Proverb is generally a statement of this is how it usually goes. A promise is, no, this is the way it will be, which is so disheartening for a lot of Christian parents who've read, the verse in the book of Proverbs, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he'll not depart from it. And then they trained up the child in the way that they thought he should go. And then when he turned 18 and 19 and 20, he went off on a completely different path, and he wandered away from his faith, and he did things with his life that he never learned at home. Why? Because sometimes there are exceptions. But if you're waiting for God to honor, you think, God, but I took him to church and he was in Sunday school and he memorized all those verses. Why is he not living the way I taught him? Because it was a proverb, not a promise. It's generally how it goes. Second thing about Proverbs, Proverbs are wise advice captured in succinct statements. Again, once you leave chapter 9 of the book of Proverbs, there's just all these proverbs, and they're just short statements, and they don't always connect with the one before it or after them, which is confusing for a lot of people who are accustomed to reading their Bible in a context. Just succinct statements. Authors trying the most creative, kind of short, simple way to establish a truth. Number 3, Proverbs are poetic, as in not that they rhyme, but they are often creative and provocative. Sometimes the way that a Proverbs is stated is this kind of interesting way to capture your attention. And sometimes it can be very provocative, meaning I'm going to kind of point my finger in your chest. I'm going to get up in your grill. I'm going to make you think. I'm going to make you hear it in a way that you'd never heard it before. Proverbs often employ exaggerated language to make a point. This is the nature of proverbial literature. At times, it uses the extreme. So we have a phrase that we're familiar with. We might have said to our kids when they were young, hey, get down out of that tree. You're going to fall and break your neck. Okay, it's possible, but not necessarily a given. They may climb the tree and climb back down and be completely safe. They may climb up the tree and fall out of the tree and sprain an ankle or break an arm. They might break their neck and die. But that's like the extreme risk. But this is a way that the Proverbs try to teach us. It warns us about the extreme possibility. It uses that kind of language to help develop in us a certain discernment about Okay, I can enjoy climbing trees, but I need to be careful because there are associated risks and dangers, and something really bad might happen. So I just need to be careful when climbing trees. Does that make sense? So, again, just trying to get you oriented to the book of Proverbs. If you read the book of Proverbs consistently, you'll start to see some similar patterns. Now, it's a really easy book to read consistently. It has 31 chapters. It's possible that a person could adopt the habit that once each day of the month, they read a proverb. And on the 30-day months, you just read 2 on the last day, okay? But it's possible to just pace yourself through the book of Proverbs. Every day, just read 1 chapter. And just keep doing it every year of your life. And if you do that long enough, you start to go, oh, wait a second. It keeps talking about this topic. And it keeps describing things this way. And that word is similar. And you start to see patterns. And so what I'm going to do as just a favor to you is I'm going to try to net out the whole book all in one sitting. Anybody interested? Good, because that was where I was headed next. All right, so it has these 2 discussions about foolish living and wise living. So if you read the book of Proverbs enough, you'll start to see that it has certain virtues or characteristics, attitudes. And so the foolish lifestyle is often, or the foolish person, is often described by their arrogance. This is somebody who goes, you're not going to tell me what to do. Nobody's going to tell me how to live. I got this all figured out. I'm the master of my own fate, so just butt out. So foolish people are often characterized by their arrogance. They're often characterized by their dishonesty. These are people who feel comfortable lying, deceiving, manipulating, changing information to their advantage. They're characterized by stealing, dishonest, foolish. And there's lots of different ways to steal that you can get away with. Foolish people pursue those ways. Interesting, the foolish person is this person who's apathetic, can be lazy, and undisciplined. This is a characteristic of the foolish person. In fact, one of the Proverbs talks about, as a door turns on its hinges, so a lazy person turns on his bed. Get the picture? The foolish person is lazy and undisciplined, and they just go, I'm going to sleep for an hour. The alarm goes off, I'm just going to sleep for another hour. And they kind of do their life that way. An opportunity is missed. They're defined by their ignorance. They think they know a lot, but don't really. They tend to be very greedy. They always want something from everybody and anything. And it's interesting, throughout the book, this greed, coupled with the apathy and the laziness and the lack of discipline, leads to a type of person who wants everything for free. They just want it to be given to them rather than to do the work. Their lives are characterized by a certain immorality, and that's not just sexual immorality, but all sorts of ethical violations and violations of integrity. They're incredibly stubborn. I'm not changing. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. And then all different expressions of being unkind or mean or aggressive. This is how the book of Proverbs describes a foolish way of life. And then in contrast, throughout the book, it talks about a wise way of living. And wise people are people characterized by a certain humility, meaning they just are comfortable admitting, I don't have it all figured out. I don't know all the answers. I'm not the perfect human being. I'll take input. I'll receive help. They're characterized by always telling the truth or insisting on the truth in every situation. They're incredibly diligent and productive and self-disciplined. They love to learn. The foolish person, they go, I don't want to learn something new. I read a book one time, and that was 30 years ago, and that's what I believe. But the wise person's like, no, the world's changing, and I love to discover more. They're incredibly grateful people. They're thankful for what they have. They're committed to purity. They can be cooperative in social settings rather than stubborn. And they're very kind and compassionate and giving. In fact, there's several proverbs that you can tell a person who's wise by how they treat animals. Just let that sink in. There's so many different ways that a wise person is distinguished from a foolish person. So then what the book does is it just invites us to all these different arenas, like how we go about living our life, the choices we make, the attitudes that we take, habits that we develop and honor, how we spend our time, what we do with our money, our friendships, how we handle the issue of sexuality and sexual intimacy, marriage, parenting, work. There's all these topics talked about in the book of Proverbs. And then here's the challenge. And this is a challenge for me. This is a challenge for you. A person is invited to read the book of Proverbs and then take an inventory and look at their marriage or look at their parenting or look at how they handle money and ask themselves this question as an evaluation. When it comes to how I handle my money, does my life look more like this? My finances are out of control. I'm living beyond my means. Nobody's going to tell me to stop using my credit card because that's how I maintain my lifestyle. Or does your life look more like this in relationship to money? Does it look like somebody who's productive and disciplined and uses and manages their money properly? So take whatever topic, the book of Proverbs is inviting us to consider how we doing. Are we just really smart people or are we in fact wise? Does that make sense? Does it help you feel like a little bit more of a sense of understanding about the book of Proverbs? So we come back to this idea that the primary theme of the book of Proverbs is the difference between foolishness and wisdom. Now, as the author writes the book of Proverbs, which was really him editing, he's collecting all of these famous, popular, wise sayings of his time. God's blessing them by allowing him to identify them to place in the scriptures. But it all comes back to this idea of foolishness and wisdom. This has nothing to do with spirituality. This has nothing to do with religion. This is how are you going to choose to live your life? And so in the book, again, because it's kind of couched in the context of a dad trying to teach his son these things he wants him to learn, the author uses 3 popular examples to describe life. Here he is talking about life. To keep his son engaged, he goes about it 3 different ways. The first one is this. He describes life in terms of characters, particularly, again, in the first 9 chapters, but this is all the way through the book. You meet these characters, and one of them, her name is Folly, and one of them, her name is Wisdom. So all he's doing is using a literary device called personification. He's taken this idea of a wise life or a foolish life, and he's making them into a person. That way his son can relate to it. And we can then assume that he was a teenager because the dad was smart enough to say, if I make it a woman, then he'll be really interested. All right? The second way, life is described in terms of a house. All through the book, wisdom is building a house and folly is building a house. And they go about building their house very differently. But we're not talking about a house. We're really talking about like how they go about living their life. And so we read this in Proverbs 14. The house of the wicked, the foolish person who lives in ways that are unfair and dishonest, the house of the wicked will be destroyed. But the tent of the upright, the wise person, will flourish. It'll thrive. It'll prosper. I think it's interesting that the writer contrasts between a house and a tent. So the wise person may have lots of resources, lots of money, live a really nice life. But in their lack of wisdom and their foolish choices, they will eventually come to suffer the consequences of their behavior. Meanwhile, you can find somebody who doesn't have a lot of means. They don't have a lot of money to rub together. They may live in a tent, but because of the way that they live their life, God's promising to them, by the way that life generally works, that their life's going to go better. So second way that she describes, or the author describes life is in terms of a house. And then the third one, which is actually probably the second most popular way in the book, but I wanted it to be third to set me up for where I'm headed. Life is described in terms of a path or a journey. So all throughout the book, we keep reading about a path. The author is describing life as every morning you get out of bed, you take a first step and a second step and a third step, and that step takes you somewhere. And eventually, over the lifetime of your choices, those steps have created years and years of your life, like you were on some sort of a journey. So we see this all through the book. Proverbs chapter 4, give careful thought to the paths for your feet. Now, he's not talking about hiking. He's talking about be careful how you go about living your life. And be steadfast in all of your ways. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Keep your foot from evil. The difference between wisdom and folly. Proverbs chapter 5. For your ways are in full view of the Lord. You need to understand that as you go through life and you follow this journey, God is seeing every single step that you make in life, every single choice that you make in life, and he examines all of your paths. He knows everything that you're up to. Third, Proverbs chapter 10, whoever walks in integrity, this is the wise way of life, walks securely, meaning you don't have to be afraid. Nobody's going to find out something about you. Your lies aren't going to catch up with you because you've been telling the truth, a consistent story. You can walk securely in your integrity, but whoever takes crooked paths, you're going to be found out. It'll catch up with you, and you will suffer the consequences. Proverbs chapter 15, stern discipline waits for anyone who leaves the path. The one who hates correction is going to eventually die. They're going to suffer the backwash of some really lousy choices that took them off the path that God had invited them. So here's the deal. This is the bottom line of the book of Proverbs. In life, you can take the wise path or you can take the foolish path. You can take roads that lead in a certain direction that will ultimately arrive in the benefits of wisdom. Or you can take a completely different path. You can say, nobody's going to tell me how to live. I got this all figured out. And in your foolishness, you may end up in a place that you never, ever intended to be. So the book of Proverbs is saying, be wise. Learn from the mistakes of others and avoid those paths rather than make all the mistakes yourself by walking the path that you decide is best. Does that make sense? So, in the book of Proverbs, we are introduced to what I refer to as the single most important principle in all of life. Honor it, and life will go well for you. Ignore it, and life will not go well for you. One single principle. It is my belief that anybody below the age of 22 ought to learn this principle because it will help them. It will protect them. It will bless them. And I think that every single parent, guardian, mentor in the room who has influence over the lives of children, you ought to know the principle so that you can pass it on to the young people that you influence. It is the single most important principle in all of life. Anybody interested? I'll tell you about it in just a minute. So in the book, the wise path leads to prosperity. Now it's funny. Most of us, we see the word prosperity and we think, oh, wealth, riches, money. No, it's so much bigger than that. It could lead to financial prosperity, but it could lead to a much greater, more valuable prosperity. How many people in the world who have lots of money would trade it all if they could just be happy? The prosperity can come emotionally, physically, spiritually, financially, relationally. God says if you follow the wise path, it is going to go better for you. But be warned, if you choose the foolish path, ignore God and his principles, it will eventually arrive at bankruptcy, emotional bankruptcy, relational bankruptcy, physical bankruptcy. It will not turn out well. So the wise person is saying, what path am I going to choose? Well, I'll choose this any day of the week. So here's the principle. It's called the principle of the path. And it's this: direction, not intention. Direction determines destination. It's a universal principle of life. It works every single time in every single situation, no exceptions. It's a principle that says the direction that you're currently taking, not where you'd like to go, wish to go, want to go, hope to go, not even where you pray that you'd go. It's direction that ultimately determines where your life ends up. So here's a couple of thoughts related to this principle. Direction determines destination every single time. No exception. Come on, most of us, we recognize this. I speak for a living, but I just couldn't speak right there. You could travel Ammon or Amman Road 1,000,000 times, and you will never end up in Candelia. I don't care how badly you would want to go to Candelia. I don't care how much you wish you could go to Candelia. But you keep going Ammon Road, you're always going to end up somewhere other than Candelia. It's the nature of how roads work. They go to one place. All right? But we're not talking about Ammon Road, are we? We're talking about life. So the principle is true. Whatever road that we're talking about, it always has a single destination. We can be talking about dating. We can talk about financial management. We can talk about raising children. We can talk about watching television. We can talk about how you eat. There's always a destination in the road that you choose to take every single time. And then, second, the path, whatever road you choose, the journey that you're on, the path leads where it leads regardless of who's on it. I don't care if you're rich or you're poor, you're educated, uneducated, you're black or you're white. If you take Ammon Road, you're never going to end up in Candelia. The path is no respecter of persons. So there's a lesson there for us. If we feel like life's not going the way that we preferred it to go, the way that we want it to go, the way that we think it should go, and then it doesn't turn out that way, and we start crying some sort of foul, like, I'm the victim here. I'm disadvantaged because of my color or my race or my amount of education. I haven't had the same opportunities as anybody else. And God doesn't love me, so he's not helping me. It doesn't work with the principle of the path. God says the principle of the path always works, but if you choose to go a certain road, I can't help you. I can't change the destination that you're headed in with the path that you're on. Does that make sense? And then the direction of your life, now watch this, this is all about path. The direction of your life is determined by the choices that you make. Every single day, every single time, every single situation. Your life, listen to this, your life, my life, is the sum total of the choices that you've made. Keep making a choice financially about how you're going to manage your finances. It's always going to end up in that same place because of your choices. Whatever mess we ever find ourselves in, if we're honest and we look back and examine it, there's going to be a series of choices that we've made along the way that got us to right where we are right now. That's true in parenting, and that's true in sexuality, and that's true in finances. And that's true in marriage. We are ultimately the product of the choices that we make. So it's interesting, in the book of Proverbs, the author tells this story, again, to engage his son. It's found in chapter 7. And there's some really interesting things that we can learn from the story. Now, it's the whole chapter. We don't have the time today to examine every verse in the whole chapter. So I'm going to sort of summarize the story as it unfolds. And it goes like this. Oh, I'm sorry, before I go there. There's always a direct correlation between the choices you make and the outcomes you experience, every single time. So it goes like this, Proverbs chapter 7. At the window of my house, I looked down through the lattice. So it's like the author is saying, I'm up in my room, the house where I live, evidently it's second story. I can look down on the street or on the city. And he makes note, I'm looking through the lattice. In other words, it's like nobody can see me. I'm kind of hidden in my opportunity to observe. And I saw among the simple, the foolish, the naive, the people who think they have it all figured out but don't. I saw among the simple, and I noticed among the young men that there was this youth, this teenager, this young man who had no sense. He hadn't really lived enough life to know what he was about to get himself into. He thought he had it all figured out, but he didn't really. And he was going down the street near her corner, walking along in the direction determines destination, the direction of her house At a certain time of the day, I was at twilight. It was just starting to get dark. Dark, when a lot of people start making choices that they think nobody's going to see. And as the day was fading and as the dark of the night set in, we have this young man. He lacks the sense and the experience to know what he's into, but he knows what he's looking for. And he's walking down a certain street at a certain time of the day, and what we read in the story is that this woman comes out of her house, and she latches onto him, and she says, I want you. In fact, what I've done is I've prepared my house for you and me. I've prepared, and she speaks specifically of this. If you want like the gory details, you can read it, Proverbs chapter 7. In fact, while you're at it, read Proverbs chapters 1 through 6 before you even get there. It'll just heighten the anticipation. But anyways, she says, I've prepared my bed. I have these fine linens and these delicious smelling spices. I'm all ready for a night. And then she mentions specifically, and the good news is my husband, my husband's out of town for the weekend, and he's not going to be back. So come on, let's party. So we read this. With persuasive words, she led him astray. And she seduced him with her smooth talk. She had all the right words to say, and he was attracted. He's thinking, this is going to be the night, this is going to be the weekend of my life. But he has no idea of the path that he's about to choose and where it ultimately ends up. And then the writer says this, all at once, he was so far down the path, so far over the edge, he couldn't stop himself all at once. It didn't happen all at once. It's now been a series of choices, but it came to this very climactic moment where it's like he could not say no. All at once, he followed her like an ox going to the slaughter, like a deer stepping into a noose till arrows pierced his liver. Whatever that is, that doesn't sound good. Like a bird darting into a snare, little knowing it will cost him his life. That young man that the author is observing doesn't really know what he's getting himself into. Thinks he does. He can't even imagine the mess that he's about to make of his life. So then the author says this, now then, my sons, my kids, listen to me. Just stop talking long enough. Stop rationalizing and defending long enough to just listen to what I have to say. I know I'm older. I know you must think I totally don't get it. You must think I'm completely out of touch, but just listen to me. Pay attention to what I say. Do not let your heart turn to her ways or stray into her paths. Many are the victims she has brought down. This isn't unique to you. This is a story that's been told 1,000 times. Many are the victims. In her backyard is just a whole heaping pile of people whose lives she's ruined because they were seduced by what she had to say. Many are the victims she has brought down. Her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is a highway to the grave, leading down to the chambers of death. Exaggerated language, perhaps, meaning you might not really die, but there's more than one way to die. You can die emotionally. You can die relationally. You can die when it comes to your trust of other people. You can die in the capacity to love. But trust me, you make the choice to follow her, and you will end up in a place that you never intended. Now, guess what? It is about sexual immorality. It is about the improper use of sex. It is. But you know what? It's not just about that. It's about any topic of life. It's about any arena of life where it's possible for you and I to make choices that will take us in the wrong direction. And we think we have it figured out, and it looks so appealing, and we want it so badly, but we just don't anticipate where it ultimately goes. And so we go that way, and then a couple months, a few years later, and we're in a place we never thought. We're on our third marriage. We're so deep in debt, we'll never dig our way out of it. Our body is so broken from the abuse that we can't function in life. So don't miss the proverbial wisdom. This is about anything that seductively draws you to it and you take, and you find yourself in a place you never determined to be. Why? Because it's direction, not intentions, that determine destination every single time. So another principle that we learn from the book of Proverbs is this, is that embracing the principle of the path is the key to avoiding regret. How many of us live in the backwash of guilt and shame and brokenness when God's saying, the whole time, I had something different, I had something better for you. If you just trust me and follow me. Because my paths always lead to prosperity. The foolish path always leads to bankruptcy. I don't want you to have to live your life with regret. There's a path that will take you to something completely different. And then we come to this last principle. Regardless of your wishes, regardless of how much you want, regardless of your dreams, regardless of what you want, what you desire, and you think your desires are so right, so good, so noble, so pure, yes, even regardless of your prayers, your direction will be determined by your destination. What you really want, if you're not going in the right direction to get there, you will never end up there. No matter how much you wanted it. No matter how much you want to go to Candelia. You keep taking Ammon, and it doesn't end up where you want it to. And this is particularly important for Christians to understand because we think, well, I get myself in a mess. I'll just pray. God, help me. Get me out of this. Fix this. Make this go away. And we cry and we get on our knees and we're like, where are you? Why aren't you helping me? And God says, I was helping you. It's called the principle of the path. But you ignored me. You refused my instructions. The path is a principle that's universal. It'll always go that way, and I will not stop it just for you. I won't. If you want my help, you have to take another path. So it's interesting. I think it's Proverbs chapter 2. We'll talk about this in later weeks. There's a verse. I find this so interesting, and we kind of like, oh, I don't like this. That doesn't sound very nice. It says wisdom. When we find ourselves in calamity, like the backwash of our poor choices, wisdom will laugh at us. Wisdom. I know I shouldn't be laughing at you, but this is kind of funny because I told you years ago, don't do this. You knew you shouldn't have made that choice and then just keep making it. And I'm sorry, but that's funny because I was trying to help you and now you want me to fix it for you and I can't do that. You're going to have to suffer the consequences. But here's the beauty, the graciousness of wisdom is to say, I know, you've made a terrible mess and all you have to do is just change direction. You just have to make a different choice. And let's go down this path because this path gets you to where you want to go. So a single woman wants to marry a godly husband. But she keeps saying yes to going out on dates with guys only if they're good looking or really wealthy. A wife really wants her husband to treasure her. But she keeps making the kids a more important priority than him. A couple really wants their kids to grow up with a deep devotion to God. But week after week, they keep skipping church to go to the lake. A couple wants so much to achieve financial independence at a certain age of their life. But they keep leveraging a lifestyle they can't afford on credit cards. A man wants to invest his final and best years in his grandchildren, but he keeps neglecting his health. No matter how much you want it, if you're not headed in the direction, you'll never get there. Does that make sense? So, if you're sitting here and go, man, this was really good today. I liked what he had to say. I just need to tell you, it's not all original to me. I learned about the principle of path from somebody else. Somebody probably a lot wiser than me. I learned it in a book. It's a book by Andy Stanley. He's a pastor and author. It's called The Principle of the Path. And he talks about it in much greater detail, much greater depth. Folks, I don't get any kickbacks from sales, but I can't recommend highly enough the value of this book. I think that every young person before they turn the age of 22 ought to have read this book several times. I think every parent who wants to be a wise and good parent should have their children read the book, which would require that they read it first. In fact, I think you would be a wise parent to offer each of your children $100 to read that book and then give you a report and quiz them about what you learned from the book. This book is that valuable. In fact, we had copies here today to sell you after our service, but I made this appeal in the first service and they brought all of them. So we're going to order some more, but you can go on to Amazon. You're big people. You know how this works? And you can get it tomorrow. I can't recommend this book highly enough. It is so good. And you say, well, I'm not a teenager anymore. That's right. You may be 45. You need to read this book. If you don't understand the principle of the path, you need to understand what God has been trying to say for centuries in a little book in the middle of the Old Testament called Proverbs. So let me leave you with this. It's highly likely that you're sitting here right now and you're thinking, man, wish I had learned this a few years ago. Because every one of us, you can think about a path that you've been on, choices you've made that have led in a certain direction. You know, I can look back on a choice I made when I was in the 3rd grade that still continues to complicate my life at age 56. So we've all been there. We've all done that. And suddenly, a verse that we've probably heard 100 times if we hang around church, suddenly starts to just, oh, wow, I never heard it that way. It's found in the book of Proverbs, chapter 3. And the writer says this. He's saying this to his son. He's saying this to you. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Quit leaning on your own understanding. Quit thinking that you have it all figured out. You think you know all the answers. You haven't even asked all the right questions. Quit leaning on a book that you read 40 years ago. Quit leaning on a professor that you had in college. Quit leaning on a philosophy that has shown itself not to work. Quit leaning on your own understanding. In all of your ways, dating, financial management, sexuality, raising kids, in all of your ways, submit, surrender, get up under the influence, submit to God, and He will make your paths straight. He will guide you to take the next step in the right direction to get where it is that you want to go. But somewhere along the line, just like me, you decided that there wasn't anything that God could tell you. And here we are years later, and your life is complicated and dramatic, hurting and broken because you decided that you knew better than God. It doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't have to be like that. So I'm going to ask you, do me a favor, would you stand up? And we're going to do something that if we've done it 3 times here at Cibolo over 23 years, that may be an exaggeration. You don't have to do it. It's up to you. I just sense that this might be a perfect moment. We've been talking about a journey, and we've been talking about walking a path. I was wondering if you might take a first step. Just symbolic. But over the 22 years of being a pastor here in this area of town, I've learned that our image is really important to us. We don't like people seeing us in ways that we don't like to be seen. So we pretend and we hide and we act like we got it all together. Well, today, what if we just hung that up for a few moments and we said, this isn't about what anybody in the room thinks. This is about my life and where I'm headed. And today, through the power of God's word and his Spirit using this information, I've decided, you know what, I'm done this path and I'm ready to change and go a different direction. Not a single person in this room knows your story. They won't know why you're going to do what you're about to do if you choose to do it. For some of you, it'll be about sex. Some of you it'll be about alcohol, and some of you will be about terrible financial management, and some of you is about a broken marriage. Some of you is about being so estranged from your kids. Nobody's going to know why you choose to do what you do. I'm just wondering if there's courage enough in your soul to say, today marks the day that I made a change. So in the symbolism of a path and a journey and a way that we walk, I was just wondering if there's anybody in this room who'd be willing to come down to this front, to just take a step, so that this day, April 2019, you decided, that's the day that I stepped out of my seat. I didn't care what anybody thought, and I came and I made a declaration before God and myself. This was the day I was going to change the direction of the path that I was on. You don't have to say anything. I'm just asking, will you take a first step? Anybody want to join me here at the front? Thank you, guys. I know enough about how people work. There's some of you saying, I'm making a decision, preacher, but I'm not going up front. I get that. So I'm going to assume that if you want to be a wise person, you're going to make a change. Some arena of your life, go in a different direction. Thank you, guys, for coming to this front. You will always remember the day that you stepped out of the comfort of your seat in front of other people and you said, I am ready to go in a different direction. And I'm looking at you. I know some of your stories. I know places where you've been. I also know where you're going to go. It's going to be good. Let me pray for you. Father in heaven, I pray for every single person in this room, including myself. And I thank you for your grace in giving us the wisdom of your word to make the choices in our life that are good and healthy and strong and right. God, thank you for your grace toward us, that even in the choices we have made in life that have taken us to places we never hoped to be, your grace is sufficient and powerful and can restore us to the courage to make a different choice and go on a new path. So God, fill every person in this room with a sense of your love. Remind them of your amazing grace, your continual forgiveness, and be with them. Show them clearly the next step they will take on their path to head in the right direction that will become a new, better destination. Thank you, Father, for your grace. In Christ's name, amen. If any of you want to talk, we're available. All right, thank you for being here today. We'll see you next Sunday.